So let's get started here. The outline for the talk is the following. We'll start with a question like, if team science is the solution, what is the problem in psychology? And then I will try to put it in the context of method reform. Perhaps we can think of it as the first wave of method reform being about replicability. But then I will at least raise the question of whether the second wave should focus on taking culture seriously and also taking actual behavior more seriously than we tend to do in psychology. My main claim will be that to be able to take this second step while continuing doing good open science, I think big collaborations, team science is needed as at least one part of our method toolbox. I will end with just some brief examples of recent team science projects. I won't go into them in detail, but I will just point you to them and try to explain how these projects contributes with knowledge that it would be impossible to do alone or with a standard team of, say, 3 people or 5 people or something. So if that sounds okay to you, I will just get started, and please interrupt if anything is unclear or if you have any questions. If not, I really look forward to discussing these things afterwards in the panel discussion. Right. So for context, I would just have a brief tour through the first way of method reform, because I think that's important to understand why the second step is also needed. So in the first wave of method reform, starting for me and for many others, perhaps with the false positive psychology paper, I read this like when I was a first-year PhD student in 2013. Where these authors show both with simulations and experiments that by relying on what we now would call p-hacking, harking, flexibility in data analysis, both in the way data collection is conducted, the way the results are analyzed, and the way it is reported afterwards. If you combine all of these things like selective stopping, selective reporting, changing the outcome, so forth, then you might have a very high chance of finding supportive empirical support for an hypothesis that is obviously false. And I think that was a very nice pedagogical move, because they, as an example, listening to a Beatles song could make people older. Obviously, we know that's impossible, but they show in this paper that if you combine all these different ways of doing research that was common prior to the replication crisis, you actually have a very high chance of ending up finding support for this obviously wrong hypothesis. So what did we learn in this first year of open science debate and method reform? Well, I think the main points is that our existing literature was plagued by very low statistical power, undisclosed analytical flexibility, and then, in addition, a selection for results that is statistically significant at the 5% threshold. And in combination, these characteristics with prior research led to an inflation of false positives and therefore also replication problems. In this phase, it was also an educational experience for me to just go back to the basics and to think more carefully about statistical power, which I think is another reason why team science is needed. There's some estimates showing that the average effect size in published research in social psychology is a Cohen's d of 0.4. That is 40% of a standard deviation. Even if you assume that that is the true effect size for the type of study you're going to run, you would need around 100 participants in each condition to get 80% power, meaning an 80% chance of detecting an effect if the true effect is there. But if you look further up in this table from Cohen from 1988, and you think about the previous standards of having perhaps 20 participants per condition, you can tell from this very simple low-tech power table that the power you would get would be 25% power. So, and even if you go up to 50 participants per condition, you would only have 50% power, meaning that throughout the past of psychology, prior to the replication crisis, even if you were testing a true hypothesis, on average, half of your experiments would fail to identify it. So that's some of the background. Won't go into this, but important discussions happened during these first years, where I think the field increasingly realized that the prior way of doing science was a bad fit with the ideals of science that we had. So this led to making replication research increasing the mainstream from being not a thing at all to being more common. It's still rare compared to original research, but it is at least more common than it used to be. In the beginning, a lot of people talked about the replication crisis in psychology as if this describes a unique problem to psychological research. But I think as we are increasingly getting more replication data from different fields, the main lesson seems to be that this is a systematic problem. There's some variation between disciplines, so some of them seems to be have been kind of handling replication crisis better than others. But the main picture is that any field that have examined their own replicability with a critical view has found that the replication rate is lower than we had hoped for. Right, so in psychology, there are some positive exceptions. I'm biased here, but I do think like research in judgment and decision-making seems to be a positive outlier within psychology, where the replication rate is actually quite high. So I think for future work, it would be interesting to think about why that might be the case, what we can learn from it, and so forth. So this is the first wave of method reform, where the main solutions has been, and during the last decade, much larger sample sizes to increase the statistical power to detect a more realistic range of effect sizes, open sharing of data, code, and materials, pre-registration to reduce flexibility in data analysis, and to be more clear about what is confirmatory tests and what is exploratory tests. Well, before, almost anything was reported as if they were confirmatory. And the last step will be registered reports, which also helps to make the journals and editors and reviewers less data dependent in the way they make decisions, and to reduce publication bias. So for most of you, this is well-known things, but I think it's an important context also for why, to get our development moving even further, I think team science is needed for the next step. If we look ahead, I now think the problems we have discovered and the solutions we have developed, and at least are increasingly starting to adapt, I think that has raised also some new problems, which require some new solutions for how we can do good science to test the questions we're actually interested in. Because I think a first type of response to the replication crisis is that I think many of us have shifted our focus to testing few simpler and more cost-effective hypotheses than before. In my view, I think this is generally a good thing, because I think it makes our research more realistic. But I think that is one change that has happened. I think many of us are shifting the attention toward basic main effects versus interaction effects. Also, on average, probably a good thing. Main effects are more replicable on average. And also when it comes to experimental group comparisons, to shrink our comparisons to many conditions to maybe just one control condition and one experiment condition, again, to increase the sample size per condition, to increase power, and to make our research more reliable and in the long run, more replicable. I think there's also now been some noticeable changes in how we search for answers to these questions. It's been a big shift towards online studies versus lab research or field research to enable these much larger samples in a way that is less labor intensive. Again, in general, I think this is a positive development compared to relying on physical lab studies with 40 university students. But again, there's been a big move in that direction. It also describes my own research. Most of my research is online-based survey experiments. You also see a change in the type of dependent variables we're studying, or an even higher increase than before in exclusively relying on self-reports, things like intentions, judgments, and attitudes, and not much research on real incentivized choices that have any consequences for anyone, or other forms of actual observable behavior. And although there is some improvement when it comes to the cultural variation in our research, the vast majority still tend to focus on one cultural context, which is what you can call weird cultures, meaning cultural societies that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So this has at least made me think or ask what is lacking so far after the first wave of method reform, the first decade of method reform, which is why I think team science is needed for the next step. So what is lacking? I think especially three things are in need of improvement. The first is to start take culture seriously as a study subject, to study whether our presumably broad hypotheses about human nature, human psychology, social behavior, to what extent they are generalizable beyond weird culture, to start to map out more systematically among our replicable, robust effects that we now are starting to build our new research on. Among this set of robust effects, which ones do we believe are quite universal across cultures? And which ones do we believe might be more particular to our own cultural setting, and to actually map that out empirically in a good way? And the second main point has to do with taking actual behavior more seriously, trying to study whether our interventions are able to change outcomes that really matter for the people that are involved and for society as large. I'm not saying we're doing none of this, but I do think there's a big potential for improvement there, where studying intentions and attitudes and judgments, that describes most of my own research. I obviously think that can be a good first step, and it can be a good way to better understand mechanisms, to explain the processes of human judgment and human thinking. But I do think in the next decade, we should try to take it another step to also study actual behavior in a large-scale sense. Third point is to take measurement more seriously, to test the same hypothesis using broader samples, both of stimuli and validated measures, to make sure that what we are studying is a broad phenomenon, and that is not just restricted to one very narrow type of of measure. So this is, I think this slide, I mean, any pedagogy seminar will tell you to not have slides with a lot of text on it. Sorry, my light went off. There's a lot of text on this slide, but I do think that it summarizes at least my point of view when it comes to why team science is needed for the next step, because taking culture seriously as a study subject and taking actual behavior seriously, it's much more labor intensive. It costs more money, it costs more time. And to do this type of study, this type of research, where we answer some of the questions we're really interested in, I don't think that is something any researcher, with almost regardless of how much funding you have, can do alone. Maybe some well-funded small teams can do it, like the way research is usually done. But for the vast majority of researchers, if you're interested in really taking a closer look at these type of questions, I do think much larger collaborations, so-called team science, has to be at least one part of the solution. So that is at least a summary of my view on this. When it comes to the two main points here of culture and actual behavior, just some background on why I think these things are understudied and not really taken seriously if you look on actual research in psychology and other social sciences. Joe Henrich was one of the first raising this point. There's a lot of debate on his views and on his research, of course, because he is making bigger claims, and that deserves debate. I think the least controversial point is that he just observed that more than 90% of the data in behavioral social science is based on less than 10% of cultural societies globally. And this is to a very high degree so-called weird cultures, and especially American study subjects. And before the replication crisis and the move to online studies, this was also not just Western participants, but Western university student participants, which is even within American culture, not very representative of the average person. Henrich also makes the claim that this is especially problematic because weird culture is a psychological outlier on many basic dimensions, things like visual perception, spatial reasoning, cognitive reasoning styles, fairness and other forms of moral judgment, cooperation, the type of self-concepts we have, and so forth. Participants, on average, in weird cultures are an outlier and not very representative for humans in general. So every time you read a headline in psychological science or Nature Human Behavior saying people are doing this thing, if you look at the data, it usually means a participant sample of Americans are doing this thing. Again, this describes much of my own research as well. So this criticism is equally applicable to my own work. But I do think he has an important point raising this extreme skewness in the cultural background of our samples. So based on these observations, Henrich has then been an important figure in arguing that we should study culture empirically, and we should study it much broader to make sure that our hypotheses that we assume are describing broad patterns actually hold up, or if we should find cultural variation, to treat that as an empirical finding in its own right that we should try to explain, for example, in terms of historical forces, social network structural, social learning, so forth. And according to a new working paper by Henrich and colleagues, it seems to be the case that even large language models are biased towards weird psychology. So if you correlate the answers to social science surveys and typical psychological measures with human responses, you then plot the cultural distance from the United States globally, you find a very high correlation, meaning that the response from ChatGPT is much more similar to the human responses you would get in the US compared to other cultures. And the farther away you get from the US culturally, the weaker the correlation with ChatGPT responses gets, probably because of underlying skewness in the training data for these models. So that's culture. The second point is taking behavior seriously. This is not a new point. It's been discussed for a long time. I think Cialdini made a very powerful point back in 2009, one of the most, I think, influential social psychologists of all time. We Have to Break Up was the title of this paper, where he basically made the point that because of the cognitive revolution, because of increased focus on understanding the mechanisms of human judgment and human thinking, it has just become, and also the new requirement of having multiple studies in one paper, it has just become too expensive and too risky for researchers to study actual behavior and especially to study field behavior, which was kind of his perhaps main contribution when it comes to the type of research he done, which he just found deeply problematic. And also other papers argued back then that most psychology do not study actual behavior, but study self-reports. Again, I think self-report data can be a good first step. It can be a good indication of behavior. But again, the correlation in many domains like climate behavior and in goal pursuit research is moderate, sometimes even weak. So I do think we should also start taking actual behavior more seriously. So to sum up my main argument that I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts on, why is big team science needed? Well, I think it is needed if we're going to continue development from the first way of method reform, which focused on solving the replication crisis and to increase the replicability and the transparency of psychological research, social studies generally. That was the most important thing to address first, and we're still addressing it, and we're still trying to improve on that first step. But I think if we're going to be able to answer a broader set of the type of questions we are actually interested in, we have to take culture and actual behavior more seriously also. And if we're going to move in that direction and still do good science in terms of power, openness, transparency, so forth, I think then we need more good team science to be able to do it. So I will end not going through these studies in details, but I will just point to some recent team science projects I've been part of, just as examples of type of research that would be impossible for me to do alone or with my own lab group alone, but that I could be a part of as part of a big team science collaboration that scientifically speaking has been extremely rewarding for me. So the top 3 ones on this slide, that's the 3 I've been part of. The first 2 were conducted during COVID. And the third was a more recent one on climate beliefs. The first one was a collaboration led by Jay van Bevel. We were a group of 5, 6 colleagues starting to discuss the possibility of doing a large global social science survey in the first wave of the COVID pandemic. And we wanted to do a study that was not just about COVID, but that could generate a large-scale open data set for anyone interested in studying the things they were already interested in with a more global data set than what we usually have. So Valerio Capraro and myself, we developed a survey conducting like consisting of a broad range of predictor variables that is of broad interest for psychologists and social scientists, and also then suggested collected data on different dependent variables that had relevance for public responses to the COVID pandemic. So we, as a team, I mean, more than 200 researchers joined the project. We ended up collecting data from 67 countries, 50,000 participants, really creating a unique data set. We published a paper focusing on the role of national identity in predicting these responses, which enabled us to see not just whether there's a positive correlation between identifying with your country and to what extent you try to adopt new health policy measures, but also whether this was a global pattern or if it just happened in one or two Western countries, which by and large it did. And we could also connect this to country-level data on physical movement patterns, finding a similar pattern. This is just one example of something that would be impossible to do alone in a small group. But when more than 200 researchers joined and every team translated our survey and conducted the data collection in their own country and then shared the data with the central team, then we were able to get this type of global data. I think I just have a couple of minutes left, so I will just briefly just show you the other projects also as examples. Yeah, an important point of this first project. So we, as a team with more than 200 authors, co-authors, we wrote up a paper focusing on national identity, which was kind of a theory-driven research interest for us. When that was accepted for publication, we then opened up the full data set for anyone who wanted to do secondary analysis on these data with all these variables that we connected. And the only requirement was that they could document that they had written a pre-registration of which hypotheses they were interested in and which specific analyses they would conduct to test their main hypothesis, as an attempt to avoid just massive data mining of this data set, but to actually have like a hypothesis-driven approach. And later, more than 50 papers have been published from different researchers all over the world. Most of them, I don't even know them, I've never met them, but they have seen our work and have seen a way to use our data as at least one part of their own research, which I think is just a super cool thing that I at least have never done before, but where I think it shows that when you do research like this, you can test your own hypothesis in a very broad and very informative way, and it can be a public good also for the field. The other projects I've been part of, the first was a registered report led by Jim Everett, Clara Colombato, and Molly Crockett. And in this case, we studied the importance of what type of moral principles a leader endorses when it comes to whether people trust this leader or not, comparing different types of utilitarian morality. What we did here, which would not be possible without a team science approach, was to do this across 22 different countries and to collect both self-report outcome measures of trust and the behavioral decision task measuring trust, to see if both self-report and incentivized choices go in the same direction, which to me was an open question before doing this study, which was largely what we found. We found quite consistent results across countries. And in this case, we found that the self-reported trust task and the behavioral decision-making task that we developed to a very large extent went in the same direction and supporting the same type of hypothesis. And the last project I will spend 1 minute in is a very recent one, which I think was also, in this one I played a very small part, translating the survey to Norwegian and collecting the data in Norway together with my PhD student Simen Bø. In this case, we were able to compare the effect of 11 different interventions based on expert recommendations from leading researchers in the field, and also a broader survey on what type of interventions people believe had the strongest belief in, and they could nominate their favorite. So again, comparing 11 different interventions, no single researcher or small research team would have the resources to do that. But it makes possible to compare, creating this kind of horse race between different interventions and testing them in the same setting with the same outcome measure, and in all the other ways making it as comparable as possible. I won't go through the different types of interventions, but take note that these were included precisely because before the data collection, these were voted as the most promising ones. The data shows that these interventions, they could affect climate beliefs, policy support, and the willingness to share information, but none of them were really able to change actual climate behavior in terms of a effort-based, like a digital tree planting task, which is really important to know. Like these favorite interventions that we have, yes, they can change beliefs, policy support, and willingness to share information, but at least in the way we studied it here, they might not be powerful enough to change actual individual climate-related behavior. So that was it. I think that was 31 minutes. Please check out these examples of recent team science projects. In summary, why might big team science be needed? In my view, I think it is needed if we want to create a second wave of method reform to continue improving replicability, but to also start studying culture and actual behavior to a greater extent than what we're doing today. So if you do not share these goals, team science might not be needed, perhaps. But if you do share my view that this is an important direction to move in, it is at least my view that big collaborative team science projects should be at least one part of the solution. So thanks for listening, everyone, and I look forward to hear your thoughts on this.